Hi, everyone. It's Alexander Fernandez with another edition of Video Games Real Talk. So, at VGRT, we try to make sure that we bring to you the best in thinking and the best understanding of business. And you can't talk about business without talking about legal. And that's why I am so happy today to be joined by Kevin Reilly, the Director of Business and Legal Affairs for a third party at Sony PlayStation. That is a mouthful, but Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Alex. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good, man. I'm so happy that you're here, man. I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, thanks for asking me, and I'll apologize up front to anyone if I call you Hector. It's just so like people understand like how we know each other. I've been at Sony for 9 years, and I think your brother's been here at the same time,
Yeah.
and we work pretty closely together. And that's kind of how we met. I feel like is through your brother, who still works at Sony. So, and sometimes when I look at you and look at him, it's like I can't tell you guys apart, which I know is probably insulting, but you guys
No.
are identical twins. You sound the same. So I will do my best to remember I am talking to Alex and not Hector,
Yeah, no
which
worries,
can
man.
be
And
the
honestly,
challenge.
yeah, I mean, listen, this is how it is. This is the games industry. We all know each other. I like to say the ghetto of video games is we all grew up with each other, and I do have an identical twin, so no problem, man. But I mean, I think that is actually a great thing that we all know each other, we all meet each other, we all get an understanding of what's going on. It is a huge industry that impacts so many lives, but it's ran by a little limited group of people. It's actually quite small if you think about it compared to the impact. So I mean, no worries. I won't go by Hector, but if you say Hector, it'll be okay.
Yeah, I just wanted people to understand if they heard me like sort of slip into, thinking I'm talking to your brother, that that's why. It's like for 9 years I've been talking to only Hector, and now I'm talking to Alex, and it's like I know you guys are different, and I love you both. It's just
Do I gotta
sometimes you have
apologize?
that
I mean,
memory.
is it rough working with Hector?
No, no, honestly, I think in terms of like when you're an attorney, you're in a service you are basically in a service industry. So it's great when you have a client who is very passionate about what they're doing and also very knowledgeable and willing to take feedback and willing to sort of go through the process. And I think Hector has and yourself both have like an interesting perspective on sort of the video game industry because you've been outside of big companies. You've started your own company. You've gone through sort of like the growth phase of learning, by doing. And so that sort of brings in a different perspective where it's like, okay, I can talk to this person and ask them a question and get like a real answer that they've thought about or they've experienced before. And that makes life easy because, when you're talking to people as an attorney, I'm representing the company that's my client. But I have multiple business people that I have to deal with and just understanding what their goals are and what they're trying to achieve. It's great to talk to somebody who really has like a fundamental understanding of what the deal is supposed to achieve and what it's supposed to look like, what they're willing to do, what they're not willing to do. And also just sort of like sees the big picture, beyond the piece of paper. They understand the relationship, they understand the industry, they understand like, you know, what are we trying to do at the end of the day? Surprise and delight our consumers, make a fun product, and be willing to laugh at themselves, and also, at times laugh at me when I need it, or to call me out and say, hey,
Yeah.
you got to settle down. Like
Oh, no. Well,
so,
that I mean, that yeah, that certainly sounds like Hector, and I think you just opened up the door to the first question I wanted to ask you because, I don't think a lot of people understand what attorneys or lawyers do in video games. I think everyone has an understanding of what do they do in real estate, what do they do for families, but for video games, what does an attorney do? And take us through this because honestly, you're the very first attorney on the show. So you're setting the precedence here, sir. You're the one who raises the bar for everyone here. What exactly? What is it like, and what do they do?
well, I'll probably answer the question I get asked the most by people outside the video game industry when they find out I work for PlayStation. And So this will be an indirect way of answering your question, but no, I don't spend all day playing video games. That might actually, like disappoint some people, but I think in terms of like sort of what do attorneys do, um, there are all kinds of different types of attorneys. I sort of put them in two different buckets, which is you sort of have your general transactional attorneys, which I kind of consider myself, and then you also have specialists. So you have litigators, you have people who work with patent and trademark filings, you have privacy attorneys, you have tax attorneys, um, and regardless of what you do in terms of whether you're reviewing a contract or you're reviewing a product or you're reviewing advertising for clearance of issues that could whether or not it's false and misleading or there's a copyright infringement or a trademark infringement. um, the goal, the attorney's job is really to sort of understand the client's needs and advocate for the client, meaning help them understand what the risks are, help them understand what decisions they may need to make, and generally just sort of provide advice regarding the law. Another thing, sort of people, I don't, I don't want to generalize too much, but a lot of people think there is a video game law, and which is sort of like not really. There's a lot of aspects of different parts of the law that have an impact on games. So most attorneys, sort of working in the video game space, have a general understanding of various types of law without necessarily becoming specialized. So intellectual property rights are fundamental, to building games, to protecting the value in games, to protecting the value in the company. And I think sometimes when you're speaking to somebody who's got a very like light grasp of various parts of intellectual property law, they kind of confuse a bunch of things like what's a patent do, what's a copyright protect, what's a trademark protect, what does confidential information and an NDA do. But essentially, the lawyer's job is to advise the client, to take their point of view and also help them understand, like, okay, here's what you need to know about the law in terms of like what you're trying to achieve with your game, and then also protect them from potential liabilities or help them at least mitigate risks. As they sort of try to navigate what their key objectives are. So again, it's not every lawyer is the same, and I think if I were to try to explain to somebody what I do on a daily basis, it kind of depends. I'm usually looking at contracts most of the time, negotiating contracts, drafting contracts. But I'll also do clearance work. If there is an issue like with an advertisement that we're trying to release for or a trailer for a show, we're trying to review it from the perspective of the consumer. We're looking at, okay, are there any third party rights included? Have we cleared those rights? Have we obtained a license? Is there potential for infringement? So again, I think a lot of what we're doing as sort of in the game industry is what commercial and transactional lawyers or specialists would be doing if they just work for a law firm and work for any type of technology or entertainment company. It's sort of the same work. It's just specialized in the sense that we only work with we only do video games. Like again,
Yeah.
it's
Well, so let me ask you this, because you're sitting at one of the pinnacles of the industry. You're at one of the market leaders. You're literally at the platform everyone loves and plays. How did you get here? Did you always want to be a lawyer in video games? Is it like, did you wake up one day, open a
uh,
Nintendo when you were 6, and you're like, I'm gonna be the lawyer of video games? Like, how? Like, when did it dawn on you? Like, yeah, this sounds like a good business to be in. It's like, how did you do that, man? Take us through your journey.
Uh, I, I don't know exactly when it dawned on me. I don't know that there was ever like a light bulb moment. I think there's always opportunities in your life where you get a chance to make a decision and you get to follow that opportunity. So like personally, it's like I think I've always been interested in video games since like I was a kid in the '80s, growing up in Jersey, and we found an old Pong console somewhere in my house. I don't know where, like my parents had it somewhere and we hooked it up to the TV, which, back in the day you had to screw, like these UHF connectors to the back of a
Yeah.
TV.
Use the
And,
Phillips to
we,
connect it.
we just started playing Pong, which was four games, basically the same game.
Yeah.
And then, we had various types of like almost computers. Like I think we had a Texas Instrument, which, had really simple games. Uh, and I think the real first video game console I had was an NES. I didn't get an allowance as a kid, but I mowed lawns for, and made money. And like my dad was like, okay, do you want to go and buy this? And, we got an NES. And then the next Christmas, I think probably the best Christmas I ever had, we got Zelda and Metal Gear, which were like
Yeah.
two of the
That
best games
those are
you could get,
seminal.
right?
No doubt. I
Um,
mean,
so I think, for me personally, like I don't know that I thought I would be a lawyer. Like when I went to college, I went to UPenn in Philly and I studied political science and economics, which are pretty boring subjects that it seems like they try to, I think a lot of lawyers are probably taken, but are probably some of the least interesting classes you can probably take as a student. That's just my opinion looking back. And what do I remember of those classes? Almost nothing. So, and then I went to New York. I went to New York City, moved to Brooklyn, got a job working in a big law firm as a paralegal, which I recommend for people who are thinking about law school, who are maybe in college or are thinking of applying to law school. If you really want to get a grasp of like what lawyers are doing on a daily basis in terms of, what is the job, you know, take a year and go into a big law firm and work and see whether or not it's for you. Because I think a lot of people who go into, uh, you know, who think about the law really have no concept of what is it like to be a lawyer. And if you can get a job at a law firm where you don't have huge student loans, and you're just trying to figure out what you want to do, there's lots of law firms that hire people, out of college who will basically say, okay, you're working on this case or you're working on this closing, and you get to see how the sausage is made. Um, so I did that for about a year. Um, Took about 6 weeks off to go travel to Australia during the 2000 Olympics. Came back, got a job at an in-house as a paralegal at this really nice company in New York. Did that for about a year, and sort of like thinking back about how I got here in terms of like opportunities. I got laid off from that job. It was around 2000, 2001. There was the first dot com bubble burst. The economy was kind of going on life support or was wobbling. And I think September 7th, 2001, I got laid off. And so I was living in Brooklyn. Uh,
wow.
September 11th happens. I wake up and I run down the street and there's, World Trade Center is on fire. People are like, what the hell happened? I was going back into my apartment, and all of a sudden, you just heard a huge explosion, and the second plane hit, and that was just like a surreal day. And I think
Yeah.
that was kind of like after the aftermath of that. I was lucky in the sense that like if I had been employed and working, I'd be on the 2 or 3 train heading uptown at the same time. So you kind of just sort of look at things that happen and go, okay, maybe I'm getting like, it's not like I'm getting a message from God, but it's like, what the hell are you waiting for?
I
Like,
mean, pretty close. I mean,
you know,
you don't need to say it, but I mean, it was message was read loud and clear right there.
yeah.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
you kind of go and sit for the LSAT, and I applied to a bunch of different schools. I got into Brooklyn Law and Tulane Law, and I was lucky enough in the sense that I had a friend that I worked with who had gone to Tulane, and she was like, "Well, there's two kinds of people that kind of go there: people who know they're from the area, like New Orleans, and then people who know they're going to leave. So you have to make up your mind before you go. Like, do you really want to live in Louisiana, or do you want to like go there and get out?" And she's like, "You're going to have to hustle if you want to go somewhere else." So I said, "Okay, well, I've been in New York in the Northeast my entire life. I've never been to New Orleans or the South for any other reason, and I just was like, the hell with it. I should just go, you know." And it turned out to be a pretty good decision. I studied sports law, which was similar to video game law. Not there's really no sports law. It's a bunch of
Yeah.
antitrust and labor law and IP, but
uh,
it kind of gave me training in the idea of like you have to sort of look at various areas of the law and understand how it could impact your client without really, sort of being in that industry. So having, sort of a 3 years in New Orleans, um, which, is a
you
pretty
collect enough
crazy place to
beads.
live
How many
and go
beads
to
do you
school.
have?
Huh?
How many beads do you still have? Did you
Uh,
get enough during Mardi Gras or what?
oh my God. The weird thing about Mardi Gras is like, you can experience it once and get that's enough. And I've always told people it's not the best time to go to New Orleans. It's literally the worst because it's freezing cold. There's too many people. It smells terrible. And for a city that is as diverse as New Orleans, go at a different time because it's got amazing food, it's got amazing music and history. But when everybody else is there, and again, partying their butts off, it's not as much fun as like when you go on like Jazz Fest weekend or French Quarter Fest or even Halloween.
Yeah.
Um, so I think in terms of you know having an aha moment in terms of like, well, what am I going to do? Um, you know, I think a lot of things in terms of like, okay, what do you want to do with your life? Like what's motivating you? And sometimes I think a lot of it is doesn't become clear until it becomes like uh, you have a moment where something happens in your life and you're just like, why am I being indecisive? So for me, I think during my second year in law school, my mom passed away. She had been dealing with cancer for a couple of years. And ironically, it was my best year, semester in law school was
I'm
the
sorry
year,
to hear that,
she
man.
passed.
Wow.
But, I went home because my dad was still, in New York. And I sort of took my third year as like, okay, I'm going to sort of enjoy myself for my third year and really sort of focus on like, what do I want to do next? And I'm telling you, like, I was really sort of um, torn between New York and sort of like what did I want to do? And I think in my mind I was like, well, there was this guy Jack Thompson who's trying to make all these claims about video games are violent, they cause people to be, cause violence, and I'm like, I as a gamer I was like kind of offended. I was like, are you kidding me? Like most of the people I know who play video games are like the chillest people you'll ever find.
Yeah.
Like they're not
And
outside starting fights or trying to make trouble. So
Jack
I
Thompson
really
was from
became
Florida. He was the guy from Florida, right? That was
yeah,
screaming about basically, they're teaching everyone how to kill and all that crazy. He was the crazy
yeah,
one.
and you know I I I was lucky in the sense like I had opportunities to work at a video game company as an intern for over my 1 year. I worked at Divinity Universal before they sort of launched World of Warcraft. Um, and it was an interesting internal look. And I was like, that's kind of what I wanted it to be. I was like, I'd rather be. I know what it's like when I work at a big firm. I wasn't interested in it. A lot of law students are kind of good at taking tests and they want to follow a straight path and they're like, I want to go work for the big law firm that's going to pay me a lot. And I was like, I don't want to work 400, 500 hours a month, billing clients. That to me was annoying. Um, and I had a conversation with my brother, who was out in LA, and he'd been, trying to make it into the film industry. And he was like, "What do you want to do?" And I was like, "Well, I really want to work in video games." And he said, "Well, then why don't you move out here and, take the bar and then figure it out?" And I was like, like adding up all the things in my head, I was like, okay, you know, what am I waiting for? Like if I go back to New York, I kind of know what I'm going to be getting into. Probably not going to be that interesting. What do I have to lose? Nothing. So I packed up, my shitty 1991 Chevy Lumina, with no tape deck and no CD player, and drove across the country with everything I owned. Um, and for anyone who's ever traveled across I-10, they know what that's like, especially if you're doing it alone. There's nothing out there. West Texas might as well be the moon. So I get to LA. I have friends who were living in Santa Monica. They're like, you can study for the bar and sleep on our couch. So I did that for 12 weeks. It's, studying for the bar is its own conversation. It's hell. You get done with it and you just hope you pass. So I took the bar in July 2005 and really didn't have anything to do. And my brother, who was like, he's sort of in the film industry, but he'd worked at talent agencies. He's like, look, all these talent agencies, CAA, UTA, William Morris, they're all trying to get into video games and they don't really know what they're doing. So he's like, why don't you go and apply for a job in the mailroom? And he knew a lot of people at Endeavor. So Endeavor William Morris is now one of the biggest talent
Oh
agencies
yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
And I kid you not, like I went in there, my first day, the HR person, who's a very nice woman, sat down and interviewed me, and she's like, "You look like a nice kid. Did your brother do this to you as a fucking joke?" Like literally her words exactly, because she's like, "You know what this is? This is uh, 10 hours a day, minimum wage.
Yeah.
You're on your feet all day, and it's you hopefully you get an assistant position,
Yeah.
um, and it can be brutal. And I honestly a year there, I did a year at Endeavor, and it really did sort of open my mind to the idea of zealous representation of your client. Those guys hustle.
Yeah, they do.
And it's a real meritocracy. It's like everybody starts at the bottom.
Yeah.
So like, you know, you can go through a day where you literally don't sit down because you're just wheeling a cart around. But, you know, you really start to understand like client service and then also teamwork. They really emphasize teamwork there. So like would, I would get to know all the assistants of all the major, agents, just start talking to them, say like, hey, what are you guys working on? Like, what do you need? And that's sort of how like I got onto a desk, is because other people are like, oh, this guy is, um, he's really trying hard and he wants to get on a desk. So I took over a desk for an agent who was representing actors. And, you know, getting actors to show up at some place on time, it was like actually really hard job. Like it's like one of those weird things where it's like, if people understood what it takes to actually make a film or a TV show happen, their minds would probably blow up. It's like it's such a weird industry in itself. And I think
Talent
after about
management's
six
hard.
months,
No, I mean,
after about
it's like
6 months,
herding
the agent,
cats, dude. It's
oh, I
insane.
know. After about 6 months, the agent I worked for was like, he just looked at me. He's like, "You're not really happy here." He's like, I'm going to help you find a job. Nicest thing anyone's ever done for me, literally, was to tell me to leave the company. So,
He's like, "It ain't
um,
you, kid. You don't belong in the pictures."
no, he would. I think he just like sort of, you get to be familiar with somebody after a while, and when you work closely with someone, and they can just kind of look at you and go, "This is not for you." And I really appreciated that, looking at back, hindsight 2020, because it's like there wasn't really any need for video game agents at that time. It just wasn't a real thing. There was a couple, but not
Yeah.
many.
It wasn't there
Um,
yet. It hadn't hit mainstream enough yet.
so you may appreciate this. I got a job as an assistant for a company. Um, it was a U.S. office of a company, a small Russian publisher, and they were starting up a outsourcing like branch in the US because at that time outsourcing was starting to become more prevalent. And the concept was the US company, the US version of the company would essentially be selling to major publishers, art outsourcing work to Eastern Europe. Um, and it was kind of an interesting group of people there, like Kevin Bacchus, who was like one of the founders of Xbox, was the CEO of the US version of the company. And
What
he
was the
just
name
had
of that
all these
company? I
interesting
remember
stories.
this. I remember when Bacchus joined an outsourcing company, but I don't remember what it was called.
Uh,
What was the
the,
name of the
comp-
business?
the publisher was Nival. I'm not sure if they're still around.
That's right. Oh my gosh, blast from the past.
I know
Yeah. Oh,
and it kind of was my first introduction of the realities of the video game industry because I joined there, and 3 months later, it was like something happened back in the motherland, and we were all out of work. And it was kind of it was kind of like that rough transition of like, okay, you finally got your feet in the door at a video game company, and immediately it got shut down. And I
welcome to
was doing,
development, my friend.
oh my god, it I look back now and I kind of laugh about it, but it's I think at the time it was a little more disconcerting because it's like, okay, I need to get a
Yeah, dude.
job.
It was traumatic.
Um,
I mean, you literally go, "I'm here, psych." You're not.
yeah, and
Company's closed.
and frankly, the job wasn't even really a legal job. It was like more of a BD role. But again, I was kind of like a glorified assistant, which I think having done that, I started looking at roles that were more legal focused because I was like, okay, the BD stuff is always kind of like amorphous. It doesn't always happen right away. You kind of have to get in someplace and try to earn your way up. So I started looking at different roles in publishers where it was maybe a bit more stable. And so I joined Konami as in their sort of like a contract management role. Um, Turned out to be more than that, but that's kind of what I did was I took a sort of like an entry level type position. And Konami is still is one of the premier Japanese publishers at the time, and at the time they were doing a lot more console development. So this was about 2007, so about 15 years ago. They had just published Metal Gear Solid 3. They were working on Metal Gear Solid 4. They had Silent Hill. They had, they had DDR. Like, Konami is it was an interesting company because a lot of the stuff that I was working on was probably stuff that people don't realize that Konami was doing. They had a whole mobile game unit back when it was Java and Brew, and they were just like a bunch of 20-year-old kids from USC. It was awesome, and they would be doing like Frogger, updates and Castlevania on 200 handsets. So just cranking through mobile games. Uh, Dance Dance Revolution was one of their sort of annual hits, and so I got a lot of experience dealing with music licensing, a lot of experience dealing with the mobile carriers, um, and then also sort of dealing with developers and sort of like work for hire developers, and sort of hiring other companies to help build games because at the time Konami had in-house production capabilities in Japan, like they had the Metal Gear team, they had the Pro Evo team, they had the Castlevania team, they had Bimani doing all the DDR games, but a lot of their games were outsourced, so they were going around and hiring other companies to build them. And I think it was a good place to sort of learn because they had so much going on. But it was also a very, I don't know how to say this politely, but it was a very Japanese company in the sense that the home sort of office controlled everything, and the U.S. and European offices were kind of told what to do. So like your ability to impact anything was kind of limited just based on geography. Um, and then I think after that, I got a call from some really good friend of mine who I'd worked with at Vivendi when I was an intern during my 1L year, Patrick Sweeney, who I think you may know. Um, and he it would just left a company called Brash, which was a startup publisher.
Brash was
Um,
an amazing thing. The stories of Brash, that's an episode by itself, like how to
well,
blow
again,
$700 million, or whatever that number was.
I went from Konami to in-house at Brash. So I joined Brash around May 2008. And again, timing is like always everything, right? So it's I was there, and then the company had released a couple games. They had a couple of big IPs that were in development, um, but things were kind of changing. And then 2008 there was this huge housing bubble, credit crisis, and there was just an enormous, like, sort of like, like when the air goes out of a balloon, all of a sudden,
Yeah.
like, no one can get any money. And it was like, okay, this was the second time I was experiencing the realities of video games, which is in October of 2008, we're all told, okay, we're closing up the company. And, I'd been there for 5 months, and they're like, well, you're a lawyer. We're going to keep you so you can help us like unload all these assets. So I stayed, through the end of 2008. And, as fortune would have it, uh, Patrick, I was talking to him, and I was like, because he had left the company before I joined. He's like, well, there is somebody else looking for an attorney you might be right for. And it was David Rosenbaum, who is a solo practitioner at the time, who represented only game developers.
Yeah.
And, I
Good
worked
dude.
for him for about 3 years. And we had a good run. I mean, like, as a second associate or a second attorney in a small firm, I got to work on a lot of things I don't think people at big firms got to do. Like, and while I was there, Sucker Punch was acquired by Sony, which, if you've ever gone through an M&A, it's the legal version of like a colonoscopy. Like, everything comes out. Um, and
That's very descriptive, but very true. Oh,
Well, again, I
fire.
don't know if everyone understands what that's like, but I will just say that's kind of what the experience is like. It's a really, M&A is very highly specialized, and
Absolutely.
for a small firm to sort of handle like a major transaction, it's a lot of work, and it's really good experience because you kind of see the value creation in companies, from start to finish, which is like, okay, these guys built this company on their own, and now they're selling it to someone else. And it's a huge event in the life cycle of any company. So for me, it's like, this is awesome because I'm used to the other end, which is like the company's going out of business. So like, which is the other end of the life cycle for a lot of companies, is like they don't end up making it and they close up shop. And you know there's there's certain things that happen in bankruptcy or assignment for benefit of creditors that are not always obvious to the outside, looking in. Whereas M&A, it's like, oh, this is great news, everybody's celebrating and happy, and often signing papers while getting drunk. So it's a little bit different. And then in 2012, I think it was, you know, David was very honest, and he was like, look, I think you've been a great asset to my firm, but I have to sort of downsize just because of where the company is going. And I applied for multiple jobs, and I think I applied for the one at Sony, being like, they're never going to hire me. Like, like, there's no chance. Um, And it was weird because the woman who hired me at the time, Jennifer Liu, was like, "Oh, I'm glad you applied. I remember you from Konami." So she remembered one interaction and said, "Okay, I want to meet with you and I want to talk to you." And so I flew up there and did a, sort of like a firing squad type interview. And then, like, a few weeks later, they're like, "Do you want to come work with us? Move from LA to San Francisco to work for PlayStation?" And I was like, "Hell yes. Who wouldn't?" So, I mean, like, and now I've been here for 9 years. So I think, when I look back and go, like, did I take a very straight and narrow path to where I am? No. But I think what I was open to opportunities. So, like, that's one of the things I try to tell students. It's like, you know, it's always hard in the beginning because people don't know where, like your first job is going to be. You're in law school, you're on a track, they tell you exactly what you have to be ready for. You have to pass the bar. And then after that, it's like, well, then what? And it's like, well, figure it out, kid. And it's kind of like you have a lot of people who are just sort of A type personalities. They like to be told what to do and go do it, and then they get an A or a gold star on their paper, and they're like, "Look at me, I did it." And then there's the reality of the legal field, which is if you don't get hired by a big firm, then what do you do? Like you can find a small firm, you can find a small company. Um, but yeah, it's rough, and that's what I try to tell people is like, look, you have to realize like your career is not A to B to C, to Z. It's going to be your own journey. And so the question is like, how are you going to approach it?
So let me ask you because, and I appreciate you walking us through this because you did not go straight line. I mean, you're basically pushing a mail cart at Endeavor, enjoying the
Hmm.
Hollywood dream or nightmare, depending how that is, to then working with David, which David is OG. He's one of the original video games lawyers. He was. I mean, this guy. I can only imagine what you saw and got to participate on, basically representing the developer, representing the little guy, to then joining the platform. In your estimation, when you look at all the jobs prior to Sony, are you able to see how much they influenced you and helped you to do the job you have today? Like, if you reflect, do you see things that are like, oh, yeah, I got that from David. I got that when I was pushing the mail cart. I got that when I was dealing, are you able to grab these little strands and bring it together? I'm curious, like, is it like that, or is this like, no, dude, it's like night and day, totally nowhere near the same?
Um, well, I think like there's a couple of things like in terms of if people are looking at it from the point of view like how does this help me do my normal job, like how does this help me do my daily job. I think having multiple varied experiences, where you're representing a firm that might be smaller than a bigger firm, you kind of understand the variance and leverage. So like there's no getting around it. Sony's like an 800-pound gorilla in the game industry. And we're all video games all the time, at least in the PlayStation unit. But when you're talking to smaller developers and smaller publishers, uh, they have much more sort of like what do I like sort of like bread and butter kind of like questions like how am I going to get paid? How do I pay my people? You know, what do I really need to be worried about in terms of things that could come up like from a legal perspective in terms of how much work, how many lawyers do I need to have? Um, and it's all kind of having an understanding of like what the other side is thinking to me is valuable because it kind of helps me kind of cut through some of the BS in terms of like people posturing and just be practical. Like, okay, what do you need to get the game done? What are you struggling with? Like, is this a real risk or is this something you guys are just hypothesizing and it's not an actual risk? Sort of understanding like from having advocated for smaller developers with publishers or with middleware companies and things like that. and just really understanding, okay, this is their concern, or I can understand where they're coming from, and let me see if I can take that back and see if we can find a solution that works. Instead of just sort of pounding on the desk with my shoe, being like, "We are Sony. How dare you question us?" It's more like, "Okay, well, tell me what your issue is, and give me the real details. Like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve for, and how do our interests align, or where do we disconnect, and how do we get to a decision?" Because my job as an attorney for Sony is to advocate for Sony. That's my client. Like, and as much as I like your brother, if I tell him like, "Hey, Hector, we can't do this," and I understand you want to do it, but we can't do it because this is the company in jeopardy. He understands that, but then I have to go and say, okay, well, what are you trying to achieve with this other company? And sort of how do you find a resolution, within a contract that sort of helps establish the framework of the relationship. Um, for me, I think the best contracts are the ones that you never read again, because people already understand like what's the baseline of the relationship, and how are we going to work together? How are we going to resolve issues? And how honest can we be with each other? And so that's like with David, I think I got the idea of like, you have to know the law, you have to understand how it impacts your clients, and you have to be willing to sometimes tell your client, like, we're asking for this, but we may not get it, but here's, the mitigation strategy. Um, I think with respect to, Brash and Konami, it's like, I think there's times you have to realize like there are some companies that are successful for a very long period of time, and there's reasons for that. Because they with Konami, it's like they're very protective of their IP. They are very cautious with their IP. I think if I have to like go back and look at it, and if I just express my frustration as being an employee of a U.S. company, it's like, who cares? The company's still doing well. Like, my feelings don't matter as much as what the company's goals are. With Brash, I mean, to be generous, I would say it's weird. It's like you can kind of see little things that might have like indicated, okay, this is a bad business plan, or this is a bad business concept. But there were still good people working there, and like that's really what I took away from it is, you know, I built a network of people that I know from that experience who are all over the place. And so I can still kind of be like, oh, hey, remember when we were there? And like, what are you working on now? Um, and so, like, again, the thread I would take from most of this is, you have to find allies within the industry in terms of, and they don't always have to be other lawyers. It could be business people you come across, or people you just sort of randomly meet and say, oh, hey, what do you do? What do you do? What do you want to do? Oh, this is what I want to do. And then I think it's also really important, like, to try to find a mentor, especially for young attorneys. It's somebody who can actually explain to you what the practice of law means. Um, and I think it's difficult, I think, in terms of trying to identify the difference sometimes, because, like when I talk to people about networking, and this is, I hate to be glib, but you don't network for your job. You network to increase your value as a professional to potential clients. So, what I mean by that is, uh, the people who I look to, like when I have questions, are not always, you know, it's not always me. I'm not always an expert, but I have friends or people I know who are experts. So if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, Kevin, I have a question," and I say, "Okay, well, I don't know the answer, but I know somebody who does." That's extremely valuable information that you've kind of accrued over time. And that shows like you're thinking about the best interest of the person or the client that comes to you. And then mentors, usually I'd say you maybe get one or two in your lifetime. And like for me, I think that was David. But David, was like any lawyer, idiosyncratic. So there are things he does that I would never do. But again, I think what I learned from him was just sort of like the process of how to really represent and put the best interests of a client, absent my own opinion, like not allowing my own subjective opinion, to take priority over what is in the best interest of a client, what is their decision. And I think that's really sort of like the things that I've taken away, from sort of my prior experience, other than sort of like just an attitude. I think, in terms of career development, uh, I try to tell students, if you're going to give me a woe is me kind of story about like how tough your life is, or about, um, you know, uh, you got screwed over because of whatever, it's like, okay, tell it to somebody else, because, negativity is something that people pick up on pretty quickly. So I've always tried to say, like, be positive. Like I've been let go of multiple jobs, and feeling sorry for yourself, you get to do that for like one night. Go out, get drunk, next day, get up, get back to work, and don't feel sorry for yourself, because no one is going to throw you a pity party. No one cares. Like everybody has their own problems. So, like I just try to tell people, like, have a good attitude, say yes, smile, like, and people want to work with people who are positive. That's really a thing that you can't really teach out of a book. It's You just got to start to realize that.
Well, I mean, the thing is, you hit on something at the beginning of this question that I find is fascinating. You recognize the asymmetry of parties, yet at the same time, you're willing to put yourself in their shoes, understand the problems, basically pick apart what is a perceived issue versus a real issue versus how do we solve this. And what I love about what you said is that no wonder Hector loves working with you. I can see why, because in the end, you try to find the way to make the deal happen. You don't just say I'm a cop or I'm here to say yes, no. You're not binary. You say what can and cannot be done, but you came around and said, okay, well, what can we do to attempt to achieve what you're trying to do within the framework of what is established and what is acceptable for the organization? And that is something that, having dealt on the other side, I mean, I should have been a lawyer if I would have discovered law at an early age. I love it. I love everything about it, and I don't know why. But at the same time, having met many lawyers, there are very few attorneys that actually give a shit to understand the dynamics. And I mean this in a way where meeting someone who actually can sit there and say, I get why you think this way, but let me help you understand why it's not. And I think that is it's fascinating. It's a skill that I think, if I think about your story about, and I'm always going to start thinking about you. Hey, why don't you push me some mail carts? I'm gonna be like
Okay.
there. You know what it is to give the service, and that service mentality is exactly what you just brought to the job. And I'm blown away by that because a lot of lawyers, they're alpha and they're like, I'm the Oracle of Delphi. No one can be smarter than me. And that's what makes it so much fun to fight them because that's clearly not true. But I mean, is that just your disposition or is that life that taught you that?
Uh, well, again, I think you have to sometimes be self-reflective as a person. Like what exercise, and this is just my shorthand, like when I'm looking at something from a contract perspective, and the concept I try to think about is, can I argue this from both sides? Like, what's if I were on the other side, how would I argue this? And then I would try to see if I can come up with reasonable arguments, and then basically for the other side, and then sort of weigh that against the arguments on my side, and then it comes down to a basic question, like, and forgive my French, but it's like, am I the asshole? that's that's my like general question, like, and it's like, no, the children are wrong. It's just, you have to kind of like sort of look at things from a balanced perspective, in the sense of, what are we trying to achieve? What's more important to this other company, or to my client? How do we get to a decision? Like, and again, part of it is trying to take yourself away from having an emotional reaction to things. I mean, that goes with sort of like understanding yourself. Like I grew up in a big Irish Catholic family, and the one thing I have is temper. And so, if you can kind of sort of separate, your personal emotional feelings about something and sort of look at it from the point of view of your client. Like, okay, I am not advocating for Kevin's opinion. I'm advocating for Sony or some other smaller developer or licensor or whoever. Like, my job is not to substitute what is in the best interest of the client with my own personal thoughts and feelings. I have to educate my client and say, here are the risks I perceive. Here's the way we can, potentially resolve the solution, but ultimately it's your decision. And sort of understanding like the difference between a legal issue and a business issue. And trying to figure out like, okay, well, what is most important to my client? And a lot of times for smaller companies, it's how does my client get paid? That's what they care about the most. Um, because money be green. I don't know like about you, but it's looking at a contract. It's
I
it's
mean, it's
not
all
they're
about the
not
money.
they're
It's
not
it lit
paying
I
for
mean,
me to
that's the truth.
pontificate.
No, that I mean, listen, as a business owner and you're in an asymmetrical relationship, it's all about how do I get paid and how do I ensure that I get paid once I've delivered. And there's nothing worse, and the industry is filled with stories of not getting paid after delivery, and that's what kills these studios. I mean, the reality is they don't have the cash flow. So I mean, I mean, I think anyone in their life can think about that. It's like if you have a salary, imagine you come, it's the end of the month, you didn't get paid. How long can you live without getting paid? That's just a basic math, you know?
Right. And, again, I think sometimes lawyers struggle with math. It's like,
That is
and,
so true. Very true.
but, if you understand, um, again, I think in terms of like sort of understanding other people, if you realize like everybody else has a boss, right? And you're doing the best you can, and everybody's got to eat. Like those are kind of like two fundamental things you can understand about anybody. Um, it's like sometimes why I love like when I'm on a Zoom call, it's like you hear somebody's kid in the background. I'm like, oh, there's their boss. Like that's the reason they're doing this. And that kind of gets back to like the human understanding of the relationship between the parties. It's like, yeah, the contract sets the baseline and the framework, but it doesn't necessarily, sort of encompass the entire relationship between the parties. There's a lot of things that go on that are outside the contract, and you just have to, as a lawyer, sometimes you have to understand that you can't control for it. You just have to be ready for the eventualities when they if they do come up, and then say, okay, here's our next steps. And a lot of times it's you know people are like when things go wrong, things go sideways, everyone's looking for someone to blame. And it's like, sometimes focusing on assigning blame, you miss the point of trying to solve the problem. And, sometimes everyone, when I sort of get asked these questions and somebody goes, oh, there's this problem, there's that problem, I'm like, I could sit here and go through an exercise of assigning blame, but what good does that do? Like what's the best interest of both companies. And a lot of times it's not to go to the mattresses. It's, hey, let's work out a solution. So again, understanding that part too is like things will go wrong. It's kind of like the Murphy's law of everything. It's like, if something can go wrong, it will. You just have to be ready to, sort of adapt to it and then potentially, work with your client, work with another person on sort of a resolution. But again, sometimes there is no good outcome. Like, and that's something I learned early too in my career, which is sometimes it is just a big shit sandwich, and everyone's got to take a bite, and you just got to chew faster. That's all. There's not much you can do. Um, so it's but again, I think in terms of like understanding like where your career takes you, um, the more you sort of focus on the positives and more the focus on what you can do in a situation to sort of impact it positively as opposed to being negative and maybe realizing your own negative tendencies. It's like that'll get you further than sort of dwelling on the past or dwelling on like, nitpicky things. That's just my opinion.
I'm curious, how when as you think about your career and you think about all the different positions you have, do you think that it's beneficial for the well, I mean, I'm sure you're going to say this, yes, but the depth of legal understanding in the games industry for developers and people here, do you think this is something that needs to increase? That people really should get a better understanding of the legality of our industry in terms of how the contracts works, how the relationships work, or is this just something like, hey, you know what, just get a lawyer? I mean, what would you tell the developers out there listening?
I would say it does. More information is always better than less, um, because it'll help you, make decisions. Um, and I think when people ask me like, what do I have to do to become like a lawyer in the video game industry? Um, a lot of times I say it's like, well, read as much as you can. Whether it's cases or whether it's a book about contracts. There's a couple of good books in the that have been published by various lawyers that sort of explain like the various aspects of the law with respect to video games. And I'm blanking off the top of mind the names, but I know it's there's one by Greg Boyd, who I'd recommend. I think it's called let's say it's like a primer on legal and business, primer for video games. And then there's I think David Greenspan is another attorney who's written a book that kind of takes the point of view of like the practical aspects of the law as it relates to um, video game development. Understanding corporate entities and formation and why it's important. Understanding work for hire and contracts and how does IP get created and chain of title issues and working with publishers, working with platforms, working with vendors like Streamline. Um, and again, I generally think like for for anybody who is interested in sort of starting their own company, I do think it makes sense to sort of get a baseline understanding of the law, at least with respect to your own country. So you understand like, okay, if I'm running a business, what do I have to do to run my business? Um, what are issues I'm going to have to deal with, regardless of whether I'm making video games or making brooms. I mean, if it's kind of hard to say like, oh, should you just delegate to a lawyer? It's like, well, again, if you know what you don't know, you're more dangerous than somebody who doesn't know what they don't know. And I think if people talk about the Dunning Kruger effect, we had 4 years of it recently in the U.S. So you can kind of understand like having a sort of like a baseline grasp of at least some of like the basic legal issues that come up um, would be helpful. And I think a lot of times, developers, I don't know what to say other than, ask other developers who they use for, legal work or who they recommend, and then go out and meet as many attorneys as you can because we're all different. Um, we all have different MOs and different sort of like businesses that we support. And I think, to some degree, it's like if you were looking for a vendor, right, for some sort of tech, would you only go to one or would you go to multiple and get multiple bids? Or, so for me, I always think of it as like you're never worse off for having more information. You can make better decisions the more you understand, but it'll also help you understand what you don't know, and sort of make decisions based on like, oh, okay, I don't have a very sort of strong grasp of privacy, but I know somebody who does, and maybe if I go and consult with them, they can take me through it and help me understand like what my obligations might be under the law or what to look out for. So from me to like anybody who just wants to understand the law and how it impacts video games, it's like, yes, go and learn more if you can. Obviously not everyone has all the time in the world, and maybe someone's like, well, I just this bores me. I get that. Like, there's a lot of stuff that makes people's eyes glaze over. They're just like, oh my god, I can't believe we're talking about this. But again, it can be really interesting sometimes to talk to lawyers. So it's like, because things happen that you're like, I can't believe that happened. So it's like,
No, I
um,
totally agree with you, man. I think one of the main things that I always tell people is that the more you understand how the law works, the better the deal you can make. And honestly, this gives you it helps reduce the asymmetry that acquire or that occurs between large parties and smaller parties. But in the end of the day, for all the entrepreneurs out there and all the devs out there, it ain't going to hurt you to understand what it actually means, what you're signing. It'd probably be in your interest to understand what it means, what an indemnification means, what it means to actually attach your milestone payments to your deliverables and the IP ownership. It's just smart business, guys. I mean, it's like I get people will glaze over, but you know what? If that can save you time and a hassle, why wouldn't you do it? So, I mean,
well, it's
honestly,
weird.
Kevin, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, like, it's strange that for an industry that's grown so so much, and where, I'm always fascinated by people who make games because they're so intelligent about things I have no conception of. I have no idea how to code. I have no idea how people make basically something out of nothing. So, like, if somebody were to ask me, how do you build a game, I'd be the first one to say, I don't fucking know. But I kind of understand the process and I understand the people involved, but I wouldn't be the one to sit down and do it. So I would go back to somebody and say, I'm do you feel that like you have that level of expertise in a field that you are not very well trained in, or you have no little to no experience in, and say, well, make a decision for yourself. Like, are you somebody who's confident to sort of do everything on your own and take all of that on yourself? Or would you rather have somebody that you can confide in, who is going to have your best interest at heart and really sort of zealously represent you? And then I think if I were sort of just making like a general business statement to anyone, get insurance. They pay legal fees. Go, go. That would be my second stop. Is like, talk to an insurance agent about your commercial general liability, and understand, like, okay, lawyers are expensive. You don't want to have to pay for one when it's too late. Um, but again, everybody is at their own risk. So, go ahead and do what you want.
Isn't that the truth? Kevin, honestly, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I could talk to you for another hour and I'd love to get into it, but I want to put out there you have a standing invitation to come onto the show whenever you want to talk, whatever you want to talk about. I definitely want to have your legal mind and insight for our audience and the community out there. If people want to connect with you, they want to follow you, how can they reach out to you? What do they follow you on socially? What's the word on the street for you, my friend?
Uh, I'm probably a terrible Twitter follow. So I like, unless you're a fanatic of the New York Football Giants and want to listen to me complain, and I generally am off social media, with all the other ones like Facebook and Instagram. But I am on LinkedIn. It's Kevin G. Reilly. I'm the only one at PlayStation that I know of. And I will be honest, I am very bad at responding sometimes. Uh, and it's not you, it's me. For everyone listening, it's more or less like, I've got to do. I get these requests sometimes, and I'm like, is this person are trying to sell me something, or do they genuinely have a question? But I generally try to respond to students, and try to, extend a hand back to people looking at this industry, because I've been doing it for about 15 years, and there's just more work. It's There's going to be more work for lawyers in the future. It's there's all kinds of opportunities. And despite what your parents might think, this is a real job. It's a real industry. It is, it's exciting and it's fun, but it's hard work. And I think if you really have a passion for not just the video games, but the people who make them, then it can be a lifetime career. So that's kind of my pitch for anybody who really wants to look at video games is like understand, it's not just playing games. It's about working in a creative industry and trying to have an impact in something that makes people happy. You know.
Well said. And everyone out there, if you have questions that you'd like to know more of regarding the legal profession in video games, please reach out to us. You can tweet us at VGRT on Twitter. You can reach out to me at StarvUp. You can also link and put questions to us on videogamesrealtalk.com. Kevin, again, thank you for coming on the show, sharing your mind, sharing us your journey. And of course, as always, you're welcome to come in whenever you'd like to come on air. And for the community, please keep on liking, subscribing, sharing with your friends. Let us know what you think about it, love, hate, or in between. You know how to reach out to us. Wherever there's video games being discussed, we'll be bringing the real talk to that conversation. And as always, thanks again for listening. We'll see you soon.